Hi, class. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 7, chapter on memory, one that I find really fascinating, mostly because of my private practice. And I end up seeing a lot of individuals that come in with memory problems. Either they've had a traumatic brain injury, or they've got a neurodevelopmental disorder, or they developed dementia in their later life. Some, unfortunately, earlier than later than they would like. What we have called early onset Alzheimer's. Let's see. So let's jump into it. Chapter 7, memory. Forming memory. There's 4 steps in forming memory. Encoding, which is deals with attention and driving the process. It's being aware of what you're wanting to recall. There is different components to it. There's 2 processes. There's automatic processing, which is kind of what they call episodic memories. For example, I usually will ask my class, where were you when you heard about 911? And they'll be able to say exactly where they were. In fact, I had one that was so interesting that she didn't see it on television. She heard it on the radio. And so it was an episodic, or not episodic. It was an episodic memory, but it was an auditory memory, which is really quite fascinating. And then there is effortful processing, and that's where we make effort to process that information. It's what they call semantic memory, like trying to learn a language or learning facts for the psychology class or for a biology class. That's what they call effortful processing. So those are the 2 kinds of encoding that we find. Attention, again, is the one that drives this process. Then we have consolidation. This is the second component of it, and that's where we establish, stabilize, and solidify a memory. The goal is to prevent it from being affected from interference or decay. And again, I mentioned, and we talked about the last chapter, consciousness, that sleep is a way of enhancing memory, makes it stronger. If you study something before you go to bed, you're going to repeat it in your mind 5 times before you wake up. Then there's assuming you sleep for 8 hours and you go through the normal sleep cycles. Storage is also retention of memory over time. And the way we do that, there are associations that bind memory together. If you've ever seen that film Ratatouille, it's a cartoon where they provide this special food for this food critic, and it brings back these memories. The smell and the taste brings back all these memories, and that's what they're talking about here. There's also, when they look at associations, there's also what they call parallel distribution, and that's association involves simultaneous activities of many nodes bringing that together. So those are kind of combined together. And then there is retrieval, and that's what we all want to do, is recover the stored information in memory. There are certain aids to memory. Attention, being able to focus, key component. Depth of processing, again, sleep. And emotion. The reason why people are able to recall episodic memories is because there's emotion to it. I'll ask students, sometimes this doesn't not go so well, but I ask students, when's the last happy memory you had? And it's ingrained in their mind. They didn't plan on remembering it, but because of the emotion associated with it, it's instilled. That's what I try to do, guys, is with my classes, I try to make them enjoyable. Because I know that if it's enjoyable, you're going to retain that memory, and 10 years from now when you've forgotten me, there's going to be something in the class, my hope is, that was enjoyable enough that you'll retain that information. Impediments to memory, distraction, multitasking, emotion can also distort our memories. They help us to retain it, but they can distort it. There is an interesting case, though, that I thought was so interesting. Story of H.M. and neuropsychologist Brenda Milner, who actually became the president of the APA. She was, I believe, if I remember correctly, was the first female president of the American Psychological Association. And what happened was, this is a guy who was hit on his bicycle. And the physician that saw him unbelievably took out both parts, we have hippocampuses on both sides of our brain, remove both of them. Not a good thing. I had a patient that had a similar situation done down in actually, this was down in Tucson that I had. He had a similar case that went on there. He's probably dead now. It was a long time ago. But he could not recall memory. But it was so severe with HM that Brenda Milner, though she would go there for, I think it was like 20 years, she would go there almost on a, Monday through Friday, he always forgot her. But what she did is she had him do a task, and the text kind of illustrates it, where they're looking at a mirror, the mirror is there, and he has to use his hand to trace, and like there's a star there, he has to draw a line within the star using the mirror to guide his hand motion. And what happens is that, the first time it's like there's a lot of errors there. Second time, better. It gets better and better and better and better. Despite the fact, and that's what's so fascinating, despite the fact that he didn't even remember doing the task. So how did his brain recall that information? And what we know is that as we explore the brain, there's different parts of the brain that deal with different parts of memory. And so in this particular case, this was a procedural memory, accessing different parts besides his hippocampus to enable him to do that. 3 major types of memory: sensory, short-term, and long-term. Sensory is just what our senses feel, touch, taste. And so, you'll taste something. Okay, I can remember what a red cherry tastes like, that type of thing. Short-term memory is also synonymous with the term like working memory, where you're manipulating information, like 3 plus 7 is 10, times 10 is 100, divided by 2 is 50, that type of thing. And short-term memory is associated with it. And then there is long-term memory, and that's, of course, the memory that deals with that semantic memory that we try to recall. There is the Baddeley model, which is kind of a nice model. It shows how this short-term memory works, 3 processes: attending, storing, and rehearsing. Just kind of glancing over my notes, making sure I cover everything that I want to cover before you delve into the chapter. Let's see. There is one thing that's kind of interesting. That's serial position effect. This I use in my class. If you're applying for a job, this is really important, actually, if you're applying for a job. I've used it when I got the job here, actually, at NPC. I used serial position effect. There were several candidates. And so what the serial position effect says is that the things that we're going to recall best are the laws of primacy and laws of recency. Primacy is the things that I've just recently heard, and that's primacy, and recency is the last thing I've heard. That's why when you ask somebody about what they saw about a movie, they're going to know the beginning of it, and they'll know how they end it, but sometimes the middle is a little bit foggy. That's that laws of primacy, recency. So if you've got 100 people applying for a job, you want to make sure you're in the first 5 or the last 5. Because everybody in the middle is going to be lost. Let's see. I'm just glancing at my notes, guys. There are some different parts of the brain that's associated with specific memory. Implicit, that's that emotional cerebellum and striatum. Motion is with amygdala. Explicit, declarative memories of prefrontal cortex, specifically the hippocampus. So again, of course, the sensory cortex travels to the thalamus. That's involved with sensory memory. We got the visual cortex, auditory cortex, so on. Just glancing over, seeing what else I want to make sure. Oh, there is something that's really kind of interesting. This is called transcranial direct current stimulation. And so I've got, the text talks about it, and it's possibly a way of improving your memory. I'm not so sure. Well, the verdict is still out of that. We know that memory is malleable, and that's why there are some concerns. That's why you'll see eyewitness testimony say, oh, yeah, I know the person did it, but lo and behold, when the evidence is presented, DNA evidence, there's no evidence to support it. Repressed memory or recovered memories is a controversial topic. I like to mention it because there was a case, not a case, there was a trend, and this was in the, gosh, it's been a while now. It's probably been like the late either early 2000s, maybe late 90s, where repressed memory was a big deal. People were doing it. It's like, oh, we're going to solve your emotional problems with repressed memories. I was never a big advocate of it. Just, I think I was never a big advocate in causing repressed memories to become apparent again. To me, it's like, let sleeping dogs lie. If they're good, they're good. Why cause all this extra problems? But it was a big push back then. In fact, there was a case in California where a notable, he was a surgeon of some notoriety, well known nationally, spoke internationally with his skills. His daughter had some depression, went to a hypnotherapist. Hypnotherapist brought up all these supposed repressed memories of past physical and sexual abuse that occurred, and so the daughter actually sued the father. It was on the national news everywhere, unfortunately, while she would make these claims against her father. And what's interesting is that the father had evidence that he was not even in the country or in the state or wasn't there. He was at somewhere else when these specific events supposedly occurred. And so, it put one of the nails in the coffin, so to speak, about repressed memories, although it was a big thing. In fact, there was a graduate from NAU who wrote a book on it, again, years ago, that really kind of exposed it here in Arizona. And so that is, there are repressed memories, but I'm really hesitant to bring them up. And what happens with that hypnotherapist is that they found out that he was actually implanting the memories into the clients, into this patient's memory. And so always just need to know that memory is pretty fallible. In fact, whenever I go to court, I often they might ask me, Dr. Reyes, what did the patient say when you were interviewing them? And I always tell them, so I have to refer to my notes because. And while I'm getting older now, this has always been that way. I said I have to refer to my notes because I know that memory is not perfect and very up to very suggestible with misinformation. The last thing, forms of forgetting. We're going into the end of it. Forgetting, memory loss, interference. 2 types. Retroactive, new experiences can cause people to forget previously learned material. Proactive, previously learned information affects it. Like you move to a new place, find yourself writing your old address. That's an example of that. I like this guy, Herman Ebbinghaus. He is not in your book. He should be in your book, though. He did a lot of research. He is in your book, but they don't give him the credit that he should get. He developed a forgetting curve. He did research on memory for himself, and what he found is that we can actually predict based off of time frames, how much information you're going to forget. Let's see. Amnesia due to head injury. There's 2 types. There's anterograde amnesia. That's one you don't want. If you get a chance to pick anterograde or retrograde amnesia, choose retrograde. Anterograde is you forget everything in the future. So it's like, whoa, what did I just say? Who are you? That type of thing. Not a good thing. I have a film clip on there looking at Clive, I forget what his last name was, talking about memory, I forgot what his last name was, who had developed encephalitis. He was bitten by a mosquito, and that affected his brain and his memory. He cannot recall. He can't make new memories. His memory is like 6 seconds long, if I remember, 6 to 10 seconds long. So he says he describes it as constantly being woken up and having to figure out where I'm at. Then retrograde amnesia is the more typical one, and that's when you forget information that happened before. So say if you're playing football and you get a head injury, or you have a car accident, you get a head injury, you might forget driving there, but you'll remember things before you drove there. It's kind of like if you've got a DVD and you got a scratch here, it just skips over it. And then, of course, Alzheimer's brain disease, probably the most feared disease that's out there. So guys, I hope that helps a little bit just to introduce you to the chapter. It's one that I'm particularly very interested in just because of my private practice, and as I grow older, becoming more concerned about this too. All right. Thank you so much, guys.